what I'm going to be talking to you about this session is essentially data collection and analysis. Now, I might have mentioned to you previously that the thing about data collection is, and it's a saying that is not my own, that without data, you are no more than another person with an opinion. So the point about the data collection process is whether you're doing a research article or whether you're doing a business venture or business social entrepreneurship or a consultancy project, it's going to involve data collection and analysis in some form or another. For your business case and your social entrepreneurship, you've got to build a business case. You've got to justify, you've got to substantiate that what you're proposing has merit and will attract investors and so on. And that's going to require something more than just a really good idea. So that's what we're aiming at here. So I'm going to take you through some of the issues that you need to reflect on as you are planning your project. So what I'm not trying to achieve here is to teach you about research methodology. That's not what the purpose of this is. The idea here is that you have a topic that you're thinking about, reflecting on, and that you're going to be working on, and that as I talk through the various issues, you think, how does this apply to me? How does this apply to my topic? Which direction am I going to follow? And so on. So that's what I'm wanting to achieve here. I'm wanting you to appreciate that there's some choices that you're going to make, and there's some ideas that you're going to have to reflect on in order to plan your way forward, to plan the data that you're going to be collecting and to plan your analysis of it. And that's what I want to achieve in this coming session, or the session that we're going into now. The first sort of major decision that you need to take is really based on the type of data and the type of outcome that you're looking for. Because you always need to think about what is the outcome of this analysis process. What are you needing to put into this report of yours, this business venture proposal, the social entrepreneurship document? What do you need to substantiate? And that will guide you as to what data you need. And this main fundamental divide then that you'll see in the research literature is between qualitative and quantitative data. So at this stage, when I'm talking data, I'm not talking necessarily about numbers. I'm talking about data in the broadest sense of the word. But you need to think about where it's going. Where is this going? What is my intention of that? And there's various ways and criteria that you can use. And this, I've tried to summarize this here in this particular slide. So when we're dealing with qualitative data, the very word describes it. It's about quality. It's about richness of information. It's about depth of understanding. So if that's what you need, if you're wanting to understand why people do things, you're probably going to be looking at some sort of a qualitative research paradigm. As it's likely to be a quantitative paradigm that you're working from. So it's quite a fundamental difference, whether you're trying to add something up or whether you're trying to explain why something happened. Those would be very, very different. And it's not that you can't do both. And when I say that, you might well have heard of, and there's lots of writing about mixed methods. The problem with mixed methods is unless you're an experienced researcher, it's very easy to end up with a muddled methodology. And what I mean by that is where you don't clearly separate the approaches. I had a student who was doing some research, and they did a whole lot of in-depth interviews, semi-structured interviews. And in their reports, they then produced a whole lot of pie charts and bar charts. And there was a major inconsistency between the way the data had been gathered and the way it was then analyzed and presented. And that was then what I refer to as muddled methodology. So my very strong advice to you is not to approach something using a mixed method approach. It's not appropriate, it's not necessary at an MBA project level. All right? It's quite common to do it at PhD level. It's a more complex study. If you think that you might be in the area that requires a mixed method, think about whether you can't just do one or the other. And that's probably going to be enough for the purposes of your project. All right. You got a question?
Yeah. So for instance, if we send out quantitatively, we send out a survey. We get data from that, but then we further want to understand. So we'll use that with graphs and that kind of stuff. But then we want to further understand, go and interview a specific group of people to get a further understanding of maybe the results of the survey. That can be a mixed method.
That we would probably see as a mixed method. So your explanation that you're talking about, all right, that would typically be qualitative, whereas the survey is typically going to be quantitative. And research is typically a cycle where we would move from one phase into the next. So you'll see one of these bullet points here is that qualitative is often used at the early stages of a project, and or knowledge generation, if I could put it that more generally. The reason for that is that when we're doing a quantitative study, a survey, we have specific questions that we're going to be asking and we're going to be evaluating. Now, you might not even know what questions to ask, so you might have to precede that with qualitative in order to understand what are the real issues here. All right. The converse might happen as you described, where having done the quantitative, you now want an explanation as to why and so on. You know, what was the rationale, what caused that to happen. That would then be a qualitative phase, and so you might cycle back into the qualitative phase. All right. What I'm saying to you is, for an MBA project, I'm saying that probably that's inappropriate. It's more than you need to do. But what you shouldn't do is confuse the two and try and just merge them into a single exercise. That's what I'm suggesting. So that's really the point that I'm making here about when you are in the early stages of understanding something, you may not know what questions to even ask in some sort of a survey. So that might require the clarification. And so it might be that you don't even know what the issues are, and that you're having to explore that and in the very early stages, in which case that's going to be a qualitative study. If you do know in advance what it is that you're trying to investigate, so if you're looking at something like, very topical these days, employee engagement, a lot of research has been done to understand what employee engagement is, what the dimensions of it are, and so on. So if you're looking at doing some research in that area, you kind of know what questions to ask. And so quantitative would be perfectly adequate in that case. So where something that is completely new, you might not know what those questions are that need to be asked. And that would then you would revert to qualitative. The timing, I've mentioned that already, how qualitative we would often look at in the early stages of the project, whereas once we've got that information, we would often go into the quantitative. Something that people don't always appreciate is that with qualitative, it's a very dynamic process that you're involved with. And that the research design, in a sense, unfolds as you're going along. Because as you go through the process of data collection, you're learning more about the subject. And in that way, you're going to potentially go in a somewhat different direction from where you thought you were going. And that's perfectly acceptable in qualitative research. In quantitative research, you can't, because in quantitative research, you're going to design your data collection instrument, and those questions are in a sense cast in stone. You're going to get that data, and you need to know in advance what the data is that you're going to need later. Whereas with qualitative, there is the flexibility for ideas, for constructs, for questions, for directions to emerge through the process of the data collection. In terms of the data gathering, with quantitative, we very much follow a kind of a scientific method. And what I mean by that is that there's a level of objectivity where, as the researcher, one would expect to get the same result no matter who was doing the research. So I can do the research, you can do the research, and essentially with a quantitative study, we wouldn't expect to get fundamentally different results. With qualitative research, you as the researcher are part of the data collection process. You are actually part of the data. And therefore, it's expected that you would get different results from another person doing the same research. Now, that's not to say that the research is biased. It's simply saying that you are integral to the data collection process, And you need to appreciate that. You need to appreciate that you will get different results. So if I was trying to investigate, let's say, a woman's role in the workplace, it might be very different from if a female researcher was doing the same piece of work, because there would be a different perspective, there would be a different appreciation, different empathy with the topic, and therefore the results might be quite different. And that's perfectly acceptable, all right, from a research point of view. You do need to disclose that, and certainly if there are any biases or any sort of preferences that you hold, you would need to disclose that. But the point is that it is not a problem to be subjective in qualitative research. The type of data we deal with in qualitative research is also very different. So with quantitative research, we are typically using numeric data. It doesn't have to be numeric, but in most cases it would be. So it's coming from surveys of one sort or another. So even if one's asking for perceptions of things or agreement with things or assessments of importance of things, those are quantitative measures. They can be soft subject matter, but they are nevertheless a quantitative data collection process. So it's in the form of numbers or categories or frequencies of things happening or timescales. Those would all be come under quantitative data. With qualitative data, well, just about anything goes. Typically it's going to be words, but it could be pictures, it could be images, it could be reactions to things, it could be all sorts of things, nuances that you're looking for. So qualitative data is very much less structured than quantitative data. And similarly, the analysis follows that same sort of flexibility with qualitative. I think I've mentioned the subjectivity of it. The richness comes in as well, and I did mention it earlier that we're looking for depth with qualitative. We look for depth with qualitative. We look for breadth of data with quantitative. All right. So what you need to be thinking about and reflecting on is, what do you need for your project? Are you trying to understand something in terms of a population or a large group, or something that you're wanting to make inferences about and evaluate in some way? The very word evaluation implies being able to put value onto something. Or are you wanting to understand things at a level and a depth as to why things happened? So quantitative asks questions like how much, how often, and so on, whereas qualitative is why. What led to this happening? All right? We can't get that sort of information through quantitative studies. The uniqueness of a person's perceptions or experience is what you get from qualitative. You don't get that from quantitative. And I've mentioned then the researcher is immersed in the subject. You're part of the process rather than separated from it. So just by show of hands, how many of you think that you're probably in a qualitative domain as opposed to quantitative? So qualitative. All right, okay. Just be aware of the fact that most researchers would say that qualitative is actually more difficult than quantitative. All right, be aware of that. You might not like stats, you might not like numbers, and you might be choosing qualitative on the basis of that. But be aware that it's more, by nature being more open-ended, it's more difficult to scope sometimes. You don't necessarily know how big your sample needs to be. Your analysis is sometimes a bit more challenging and than quantitative. With quantitative, you've got your sample of data, you crunch the numbers, you produce the charts, or you do the factor analysis, whatever the case may be, and you write it up and it's done and dusted. Qualitative is not so easy to get your hands around and to really assimilate. So what I'm suggesting is that if your reason for going qualitative is that you don't like numbers, all right, maybe just put that on hold for a bit, because it's quite possible that some of the techniques that I'll be showing you over the next few sessions will actually be easy enough for you to use without having to know a whole lot of statistics, because the software does a lot of that stuff for you these days. You're allowed to outsource anything that doesn't have intellectual content to it. So, as an example, I had a student with me this afternoon, and her supervisor, as it turned out, and I ran a factor analysis for them because I can do a factor analysis in my sleep, all right? But the point is that the interpretation of that is up to her now, as the student, all right? So interpreting I can do it because there's no intellectual content to running a factor analysis. But what it means in the context of her research, all right, there's intellectual content, therefore she must do that interpretation of it.
But the only way that will be picked up is if someone had to do the interpretation for me, how would one pick that up?
Are you asking if you could get away with it?
No.
Of course not.
So some people, what happens is they get someone to interpret for them, and then they understand it. So they make sense of what is being told to them.
Oh yeah, that's fair enough. There's no problem with that as kind of a learning process. No problem with that at all. That's as long as the write-up.
Yeah, no. So someone explains. No, this is what it means.
That's fine. The problem comes, and I've had students from other universities calling me names because I wasn't prepared to do their write-up for them because other consultants do that, quote unquote. All right. So that's what I'm saying. That's not acceptable. But be very cautious because I was looking at a research report earlier this week where the student had clearly got somebody to do their stats for them but had not understood them and produced vast amounts of printout of tables, of charts with virtually no connection. All right, so there, obviously somebody had done the analysis and the student had not actually assimilated and understood it. So just be very careful about that, but it's perfectly acceptable to do it. I do a lot of work for MBA students in terms of data analysis because that happens to be my area. Okay. One of the things that don't know if I mentioned it when I was talking to you about plagiarism, the whole issue about understanding. You must only ever present something in terms of your project report or your proposal that you understand. All right? It relates to plagiarism, where the sort of adage that I recommend to people is understand what you read and write what you understand. Okay? Because if you do that, you can't be plagiarizing. And the same thing applies with data analysis. Understand the analysis and write about your understanding. Don't just write about something because somebody explained it to you using those words. It becomes very obvious. When you read it, there's a disconnect. All right, and you get severely penalized for that. Okay. All right, so just to make that point that there are a number of techniques that are statistical and quantitative, but give you very much very interpretive and softer kind of outcomes. And that's the area of multivariate analysis. And we will be doing a couple of sessions on that. So I ask you to be open-minded with that. This definition is not absolute. Let me say that right to conclude. So it's not that you've got qualitative and you have sort of quantitative and never the twain shall meet. We're moving into an area of big data. And if you think about big data's the characteristics of big data, some of that falls onto the qualitative side, and yet the tools are very much quantitative. So the area of big data is moving into a new research paradigm, but I'm saying to you, be very cautious of going into that space as a relatively new researcher, that it becomes complicated to make the correct inferences and deductions from that. But I'm just saying, just to conclude, I don't want you to go away thinking that these things are totally separate. That they actually can be integrated with care and with caution. Okay. So what I'm going to talk you through now is just the type of issues that you need to reflect on and think about, whether you're doing qualitative or quantitative, as you design your research. So they really are a number of sort of dimensions almost of the challenge that you face in planning your data collection and analysis process. So the first one there, the extent to which your research questions or the issues that you're looking at being resolved through your data collection, are they well defined or are they less well defined? Is it an exploratory process that you're going through? Or is it more formal, almost a confirmatory process where some theory says how you should do it, and now you're just going away and calibrating it to some extent? It tends to be that in the earlier stages, that exploratory stage, you might well find yourself guided towards the qualitative, whereas a more formal study is more quantitative. When you're collecting data, what you are typically trying to do is, because we're in the social sciences here and the projects are typically going to be in the social sciences, you're trying to get inside people's heads. Now that's pretty difficult, okay? So you've got to think about, when you are getting access to this data, how close are you to what's actually happening inside people's heads? If you can observe them doing something, if you can observe their behavior directly, you can get pretty close to what's happening, all right? You won't necessarily know what exactly is going on inside their heads, but by observing people in their real environment, you're actually seeing, as the researcher, you're seeing what's happening. If I ask you a question about how you feel about your organizational culture or how engaged you feel as an employee, and you then fill in a questionnaire for me, I'm not getting inside your head, because you're going through a filtering process, maybe unconsciously, maybe consciously, but there's a process that you're having to go through in order to then put a mark on a questionnaire or click a box on a survey. So you're not getting direct access to that data, and that might affect the reliability of the data, because you might actually not be getting a true and accurate reflection of what's going on inside people's heads, and you need to be aware of that. We'll talk a bit more about it in the next session when we talk specifically about reliability and validity. But just to be aware that if you ask people about their intentions, they often don't give you an accurate response. It can be particularly difficult where if you're looking at a business venture and you're wanting to quantify people's acceptance of a concept, people are probably going to exaggerate the degree of acceptance of that concept. They say, no, that's a great idea, I'll definitely buy that, or I definitely want to invest in that. The reality is that they may not. So that's the point about it, going through this filtering process. Whether it's a survey or whether you're sitting talking to them in a structured or semi-structured interview situation, it goes through a filtering process. It may be that you don't even have access to the people involved. When I was doing my MBA, I was doing the negotiation skills elective. I was doing a project on the negotiations leading up to the constitution of the Union of South Africa in 1910. Nobody was alive still that was around then, okay? So I didn't have access even to the people or their perceptions. All I had was the diaries of a few people that had been involved with that. So not only was it going through a filtering process as they were writing their diaries, I didn't even have access to all of the people that were involved, because only a handful of people wrote diaries. So again, I was even further away from the data, and so the reliability of that data was potentially problematic. I'm not saying it was, but it was potentially, and that it was maybe not complete. All right. So being aware of what it is that you are actually trying to measure and what you actually have access to, and that they may not be exactly the same thing, is quite important. Surveys would be quantitative typically, yes. Quantitative, not qualitative. Qualitative is typically in-depth interviews, document analysis, semi-structured interviews. That's more of a qualitative technique. Secondary data is data that already exists on a database or company data, and you go and access that directly off a database. Historical data typically. Right? Quantitative would be very much be surveys and that sort of thing and questionnaires that you might send out to people. That's quantitative typically. Some of you might be involved with sort of an experimental design where you're trying to understand what causes people to do things. You might ask people to come into a situation and evaluate something, or you might want to see how people work within a group, and group decision making or something like that. And that's where you as the researcher can influence the process that's taking place and influence the variables that are being measured. More typically, you're going to be doing what we call an ex post facto, or after the fact research, where you are gathering data about what people's experiences are or what their feelings are. So it's not so much that you've got influence over the variables, you're simply measuring what already is. The purpose of your research is important to think through. Now, what I mean by that is, are you trying to describe a situation? Are you trying to understand why things occurred? In other words, what caused things to happen? Or are you trying to model something that is going to happen, as in a predictive situation? Because there are different requirements for those three levels. So when I'm talking about describing a descriptive study, it's really just about describing what has happened, what is happening, describing the circumstances, without trying to make inferences about what causes something to happen. So it might be that I'm seeing that I'm testing to see whether males and females earn different salaries within a particular industry, all right? And I might simply be interested in reporting that as a research finding, without going into why they're the differences. If I want to go into why they're the differences, I'm going to need to do different research. So if my intention is to understand the causal links, then I need to make sure that I'm looking at that and not just looking at describing a situation. A lot of people will want to research the impact of something on something else. If that's what you're saying, that's what your research is, then you are looking at a causal relationship between the two. That this impacts that. Not just that something is different because of something, as a result, or it appears differently, but you want to find out the connection between the two. If that's how you're stating your problem, if you're basing your problem statement on something causing a change in something else, understand that you need to investigate those processes, the connection between the two, not just see whether there happens to be a difference. It's the difference between, in stats we talk about correlation and causation. Correlation is just when two things happen to happen simultaneously. All right. So if I were to look at the price of bread over the last 10 years and the price of BMWs over the past 10 years, I will find that there's a very strong correlation. All right. That does not mean to say that every time the bread price goes up, BMWs get more expensive. All right. That would be a causal relationship. You see. So understanding the difference between describing something and describing what caused something to happen is important to differentiate. And then, if you're wanting to do a predictive study, you're probably going to have to understand the causal links first, and then make some assumptions about what's going to happen in the future. So it's almost as if those three layers, the descriptive, the causal, and predictive, they're a sequence. That if you're going to do a causal study, you're going to have to describe what happens. If you're going to do a predictive study, if you're wanting to predict what's going to happen, you're going to have to understand what causes it to happen and describe it. And be very cautious on this one, because those of you that are involved in putting a business case together, you probably are going to be looking at a predictive modeling situation. You're going to be wanting to predict that your business is going to succeed, or the social entrepreneurship project is going to be a success. Therefore, you're going to have to understand what would make it a success. You're going to have some data that substantiates that. And you're going to have to then describe it so that we can understand it as well. That you've got project successes. All right. So, success criteria, profitability, delivery on time, that sort of thing. Now, if you're doing a descriptive study, you might well say, well, what we have found is that when you put that in place, then we have found that happens. But you haven't done a causal study, because you haven't actually looked at whether that was the thing that caused that. Normally, if you're doing it quantitatively and looking at causality, it's normally we would word that as perceptions of, rather than try to claim that it was necessarily the case. So it might be perceived impact of such and such on such and such. because then we are being explicit that it's as it's been perceived by the participants. If you're going to claim it as a fact that this causes that, be sure that you've actually looked at the processes and the connections between the two, rather than just association, to use that word, and that's a good word.
Okay, so would we still have to prove or try and infer after that? So
I'm saying you need to be very cautious of it, because what you can do is in your data collection, you can do it descriptively, all right? But then in your discussion, be careful about claiming causality if you've only done a descriptive study. What you might well want to do is you can be speculative. You can say in your discussion, it may be because of that, or such and such a researcher found that it was because of that, or future research can look at whether this causes that. But don't make the claim unless you've actually researched the connection. That's what I'm saying. A situation, it could be descriptive. If you're evaluating the relationship between them and the impact of something, it's probably going to be causal. Yeah. Probably isn't going to be predictive. Probably not. Yeah. The time dimension, most of you are going to be looking at a cross-sectional study, and what a cross-sectional study is a study where the data is collected at a single point in time, where the time dimension doesn't come into it. If you are doing a longitudinal study, you're probably going to be using secondary data, just simply because of the availability of time. A longitudinal study would typically be over an extended period to see what happens, let's say over a 10-year period or something like that. So most of you will be in a cross-sectional study. The scope of your project is important in the sense of understanding whether what you're doing is applicable to a broader group or broader population. Now we'll talk about that in a moment, just towards the end, and we'll talk about it when we talk about external validity. But understand whether you're looking at a specific case of something or whether you're looking at a more generalizable phenomenon, all right? Because your approach is going to be different. And what I've said to you is that in terms of the relevance of what you're doing, think about whether it is relevant only to that context or whether it is relevant more generally. Because if it is more relevant generally, you're more likely to be in a research article. But if it's got narrow relevance, you're probably going to be doing a consultancy project. So that's another divide that comes into it. How you do the research in terms of the research environment is another factor to consider. Are you looking at it as going out into the field and getting data from people that are actually out there in the profession, in companies? Probably a lot of you will be doing that. Are you doing it where you set up some sort of an environment like an experimental design where you're looking at sort of in a laboratory setting almost? Or, and this is perfectly acceptable and much research these days is done that way. In fact, my PhD was done purely as a simulation. I didn't gather any real data in a sense for my PhD. It was purely based on simulation and modeling, and there's no reason not to do that. So that's perfectly acceptable as well.
The example of simulation?
Okay, so if I'm wanting to well, what I did in my PhD was I was looking at how small groups interacted with one another, and I gave sort of hypothetical participants and engaged them in a mathematical modeling situation. Another one that we use a lot, the technique that I've talked about, is fuzzy cognitive mapping, where we map a complex situation in terms of interrelationships or causal links, all right? And we then model that on paper, and we say, if that were to happen based on the causal relationships, we expect this outcome. It's a useful way of, very useful predictive modeling tool. Okay. Called fuzzy cognitive mapping. And the last one on the slide here, are you looking at people in their normal routine, or are you in some way asking them to modify their routine? And again, it's got down to the validity. If you're simply observing people going about their day-to-day activities in the workplace, then that possibly is going to give you better, more reliable results. Possibly, not necessarily. I'm not going to go through this particular set of slides. They're very similar. But if you want to, you can go to Groenewold. He's got a similar classification process. And he looks at 2 dimensions. You can see that dimension there The direct, indirect documentary is exactly the closeness to the data that we had in the previous slides. What he does is he then categorizes different methodologies on that grid, okay, and also looks at how one might do the analysis on those. Right, so this is in the slides. I'm not going to talk through it in detail, but the reference is there. Sorry, this one is just a list of different, it's almost a menu of different topics that you might want to consider as a methodology. Under the survey techniques, I'm going to touch on most of those in later sessions. All right, but you'll see that there's various techniques here that you might want to choose from. Don't choose grounded theory. Don't choose phenomenological studies. PhDs battle with that. All right. And you're probably going to get bogged down in it. But those are alternative methodologies. Why are you smiling? Why do you say that?
What if I want to do it?
All right, you're welcome to. All right? But bear in mind that it is very challenging intellectually and academically. All right? So if you do it, know that my advice is don't go there, because it's a contested space academically, and it's a very challenging space. All right? But I'm not preventing you from doing it. I was going through some of the ethical forms. These two students, quite independently, were going to be carrying out face-to-face interviews. All right? That's perfectly normal, face-to-face, semi-structured interviews. When it came to the question, does your research involve human participants? The answer was no. All right? Now, I had a challenge with that, because unless they're going to be interviewing the family dog, all right, how come they're doing face-to-face interviews but not with people? So I had a real challenge around that. Okay. You're looking confused? Trust me, I was confused as well. All right. But often get a little bit confused. It's the whole area of sampling. And the idea is that when you're doing research, you're typically looking at with external validity, you're wanting to apply your knowledge and your insights to a wider group. Now, this applies specifically, as I say, to research rather than to a business venture or a case study typically, because there you're looking at the specific context as being important. So what you do is, if you're wanting to do something that is broadly applicable, there's a population to which your research is going to apply. Now, when you do your data collection, you generally don't have access to everybody in that population. You generally have access to a smaller group, which we refer to as the sampling frame. Now, what I mean by that is that if you're doing, let's say, research on middle managers in South Africa, you're probably going to access middle managers who are here in Gauteng. You're probably not going to go all around the countryside and sample from people all around in middle management positions. That doesn't mean to say that your research is not applicable to people that work in Cape Town or Durban or Bloemfontein, wherever. All right? So your population can be out there, but the sampling frame is that group from which you're going to sample your data. Then you've got your sample that you actually have data from. All right? So you've got data that you're going to analyze, and the reason you're analyzing that data is to tell you something about the population. So you're making inference, and that's what we call inferential statistics. You're taking what you found in the sample and applying it to the population. So that's what sampling is. And it's a quantitative concept. Because when you're doing qualitative research, you're not trying to get a representative sample. What you're trying to get is insights and depth and richness of understanding, which is individual, it's unique. It's not about extrapolating that to a population. Now, in order to get the sample, it has to be representative. So the sampling techniques that you might want to use, if you're doing a representative study, you probably want to be in one of these areas over here, where you've got this probabilistic sampling. Now, what that means is that to be a true probabilistic sample, that every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected to be part of your sample. All right. So that can be very, very problematic. The other techniques are just variations on that. But the point about that is that gives you a representative sample. These set techniques over here don't necessarily, well, they don't give you necessarily a representative sample, but it also doesn't mean to say that you can't use those for quantitative research. In fact, most of you probably will be using one of these techniques which is not representative, but I'll talk to that in a second. Convenience sampling is when you sample people who are easily accessible to you. You've probably had surveys from MBA students. All right, why do you think they contacted you? Because you're easy to get hold of. It was convenient. All right, that's a convenient sample. Using your social network is another one. All right, it's convenient to access that. If you do that and you are going to extrapolate it to the population, your research population, you need to justify that the difference between the group that you've sampled and the population as a whole is not significant. Alternatively, you need to qualify your results and say there might be some bias. For MBA research, that is perfectly acceptable as long as you understand that and acknowledge that there might be some bias in the results. So that applies to all of these techniques, that if you go that approach, you need to disclose that there might be some bias. And by bias, I don't mean prejudice. I'm just saying a statistical bias, that your results might be greater than or less than or in some way different from the population as a whole. As an exploratory study, that is often perfectly acceptable.
A specific company, a specific sample, so it's convenient sampling, but do you still have to prove external validity? Okay. So if you're saying that, look, the research shows that there's some sort of association with the concepts, however, you've only looked at the specific sample.
It depends on how you're framing it. If you're saying that your population is state-owned entities and you're using Eskom as your sample, right? You would have to argue that Eskom is representative of the population if you're going to be claiming external validity. You would have to justify it so that the reader is comfortable, because generally a single case is not representative of a whole population. I cannot represent academia, right? Because as a single case, you can talk to me about my experience of academia, but that would be unique to me. But you shouldn't then extrapolate it into the population. Does that help?
It's just going to be difficult to argue that.
I know. Then don't. Then frame it, and don't claim external validity if it's not. That's all I'm asking. I want you to understand it.
Yeah, so that's what I'm asking. So if I don't claim external validity, is that fine?
Yes. That's what I said. As long as you disclose it, because then you've understood it.
Okay.
Then it's fine.
Yeah.
Question.
Is there a guide on what is the right sample size?
Everybody always asks that, and that's problematic because it does depend on what you're trying to do with the data. All right?
I'm assuming the supervisor will then.
Yeah, the supervisor or myself, I can advise you. It does depend, because if you're doing a factor analysis, you might need 120 sample. If you're doing a simple demographic analysis, you might be able to get away with 30, or So it really does depend on what you're trying to do with it. Okay, so normally the sort of quantitative samples that people are working with on an MBA are somewhere around about 100, 150 survey respondents, something like that. That's quite typical, and we normally try and work around that. You can always reframe something as an exploratory study, you see. So if an ideal sample size was 600, all right, and that's just not going to happen within the time span or within your resources, and you only get 150, we say, well, that's fine. It's indicative of the results, excuse me, and make a recommendation for further research. Okay. With qualitative, if you're doing in-depth interviews, we would generally be looking at around about 12 to 15, maybe 20 at maximum. Nothing more than that.
Minimum?
If you were to do, let's say, 10, I would be more comfortable if you were able to say, right, I did 10 and I reached what we call saturation. Now, what saturation is where when you did the 9th and the 10th interviews, you were getting very similar results and you weren't getting new insights. All right. So if you only did 10, but you told me that, then I'd say, okay, that's fine, no problem at all. But if you only did 10 and you were still getting new insights out of that, as a researcher, you should actually go and do some more. So we look for that saturation. So when I say 10, sort of 12 or 15, I'm sort of saying that's typically what we would find. But it's not an absolute number. Please don't quote me and say that Anthony said that 12 was enough. All right. If you're doing a survey of a small group, all right, does that mean that you've actually got a very small population? It's possible you do. And that's why with this slide here, I'm actually showing those three as separate. Because think about, and it's one of the things you need to talk about in your proposal, is going to be, you're going to talk about your sample, but you're going to talk about what the population is that your research applies to. The purpose of sampling is where you select people for a purpose. So if you're wanting to understand something about renewable energy, and you're doing a fuzzy cognitive map on renewable energy usage in the future, the man in the street is probably not going to know a lot about that. So you might choose people to participate in your survey who are knowledgeable on the subject. That's the purpose of sampling. Quota sampling is where you want a certain representation from each group within a sample. So it might be that you want to make sure that you get a sample of 30 from middle management, from senior management, and from workers within an organization, and you take 30 from each or something like that. So that would be a quota sampling. So it's not a proportional thing, but you're wanting to make sure that every group is represented within your data. A self-selection sample is something that we can't generally get away from, because ethically we can't compel people to participate in our research. So there's always an element of self-selection sampling. In other words, that people choose to participate or not. It's one of the problems that people have when they're using social media as their data collection avenue or channel, is that the people that choose to participate in that survey might have some form of bias or leaning in a particular direction that is not the same as the population. All right? But it's almost inevitable that there's going to be some element of self-selection in the process. And then snowball sampling is quite a convenient way of doing it, where there are a limited number of people that are knowledgeable in the field, and you happen not to know those people, maybe 3 or 4 people. Snowball sampling would be where you do your in-depth interview, typically, rather than a survey, and you say to people, who else do you think might be able to share their insights into the subject? And you then go to those people and you ask them the same question. So you build up your sample on the basis of your initial group. The problem with that is that you run the risk of missing a complete sort of demographic area group by doing so, because if they're sort of quite tight social networks, then people won't recommend people outside of their social network. So it can be problematic to do it that way, but it's an easy way of growing your sample if you need to. So that's where I want to leave it for now. So what I've hoped to achieve from this is to get you thinking about the design of your project, the data collection and the analysis, to think about the sorts of issues that you're going to be looking at. What we'll talk about next week then is some of the actual data collection itself. We'll talk about surveys and how to effectively get reliable and valid information from surveys and interviews. And if we have time, we should have time to then cover the analysis of some basic analysis of surveys. So that's where we'll take it from there. If I could just ask you, anybody that hasn't yet filled in the acknowledgement of responsibilities form, if you could sign that, you can keep. There's enough copies here that you can keep one for yourself, and it will be available online. So those of you that are watching this on video, if you can kill it off Sakai and complete it for me and submit it to me. Thank you.